What turns a mother into the architect of her own family's destruction? What transforms marriage, childbirth, and trust into instruments of calculated harm? And how does someone commit atrocity after atrocity, not in the shadows of society, but in plain sight, shielded by sympathy, paperwork, and a gentle voice? These questions sit at the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in South Korean history. It is the case of a woman the media would later call the Black Widow of Korea. Her real name is Insu, and for years she lived behind a carefully constructed mask. To neighbors, doctors, insurance agents, and even investigators, she appeared to be a devoted wife, a grieving mother, and a victim of repeated misfortune. Behind closed doors, however, a very different reality unfolded. Insu was born in 1976 into a society that valued family cohesion and maternal sacrifice. From the outside, her life followed a familiar path. She married young, became a mother, and worked in the insurance industry, a profession built on risk assessment and trust. Yet beneath this ordinary framework lay a pattern of behavior marked by entitlement, emotional detachment, and a relentless pursuit of material comfort. According to those who encountered her early in life, Insu displayed little concern for the well-being of others. Desire, once formed, demanded immediate satisfaction, regardless of cost. As her adult life progressed, tragedy began to follow her with unsettling frequency. A child died. A husband became gravely injured, then blind. Another partner suffered a similar fate. Fires erupted. Insurance claims multiplied. Each incident, when viewed in isolation, seemed plausible, even tragic. Accidents happen. Illness strikes without warning. Families collapse under stress. But when these events are examined together, a darker pattern emerges, one that exposes not chance but intent. This is not a story about sudden madness or a single crime of passion. It is a case defined by repetition, planning, and escalation. Insu did not merely exploit the insurance system, she understood it intimately. She did not act in moments of uncontrolled rage. She waited, calculated, and adjusted when circumstances changed. Most chilling of all, her victims were not strangers. They were the people closest to her, those who trusted her without reservation. These horrifying stories are more than just cold headlines on a page. They are sharp glimpses into the darkest corners of human behavior, where manipulation replaces empathy and cruelty hides behind care. To not miss any of the next case files and criminal portraits that will be opened on this channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because in the world of crime, the truth does not fade with time. This is the story of Insu, a woman who turned love into leverage, family into opportunity, and trust into a weapon. And as we begin to open her file, one question remains unavoidable. How many warning signs were missed before the damage became irreversible? Long before Insu became a name whispered with fear, her behavior followed a pattern that, in retrospect, appeared disturbingly consistent. According to accounts from people who knew her during childhood and adolescence, she displayed an early sense of entitlement that set her apart from her peers. Empathy was not entirely absent, but it was selective and conditional, often overshadowed by a persistent belief that her own needs took precedence over those of others. As a student, Insu reportedly showed little hesitation in crossing boundaries when desire was involved. If something caught her attention, whether it was food, money, or an object of value, she expected immediate access. One early incident, later cited by investigators, involved her knocking a classmate unconscious in order to steal a credit card and go shopping. At the time, the act was treated as an isolated delinquent episode. No broader psychological intervention followed. The moment passed. but the underlying behavior did not disappear. After graduating from high school in 1995, Insu left her family home and entered adulthood with an unusual level of confidence and self-assurance. She found work as an insurance planner, a profession that demands persuasion, meticulous documentation, and a clear understanding of risk and compensation. Colleagues later described her as articulate, composed, and strikingly attractive. She was tall, slender, and possessed a calm demeanor that inspired trust. These traits proved professionally useful, allowing her to build rapport quickly with clients and supervisors alike. This occupation would later become one of the most critical factors in her criminal trajectory. Insu did not simply sell insurance. She studied it. She learned how claims were evaluated, how different providers communicated, and where scrutiny was most likely to be relaxed. According to court records, she understood how to distribute policies across multiple companies to avoid triggering internal alarms. At this stage, however, there was no indication that she intended to exploit this knowledge for criminal purposes. On paper, she was a competent young professional, building a stable future. Her personal relationships, however, revealed a different side. Insu's romantic involvement with her first husband, Lai, developed rapidly. They moved in together quickly, and when she became pregnant, marriage followed despite their young age. Those close to the couple later recalled that the relationship was strained almost from the beginning. Lai worked diligently and lived frugally, yet his income could not sustain Insu's increasingly extravagant expectations. Disagreements over money became frequent and intense, creating a climate of constant tension. When Insu gave birth to their daughter, the family structure did not stabilize as expected. Instead, Insu returned to her parents' home, leaving Lai to care for the child alone for a period. This decision, described by relatives as abrupt and emotionally detached, foreshadowed a recurring pattern. When circumstances no longer aligned with her desires, Insu withdrew rather than adapted. After her father passed away in 1998, she reportedly used his credit card without consent, spending large sums of money. This act caused a deep fracture within her family and further isolated her from emotional accountability. From a psychological perspective, experts later noted that these behaviors aligned with traits commonly associated with narcissistic and antisocial tendencies. It is important to emphasize that these observations are based on documented actions and formal evaluations, not retrospective moral judgment. According to psychiatric assessments presented during her trial, Insu demonstrated a diminished capacity for guilt, a strong need for control, and a tendency to view other people primarily as means to an end. These traits became more pronounced following the death of her 3-year-old daughter in February 2000. Officially recorded as an accident, the child's fatal fall down a staircase marked a turning point in Insu's life. Investigators would later note that after this incident, Insu's behavior shifted from opportunistic manipulation to deliberate and escalating violence. 2 months after the child's death, she sought psychiatric consultation, claiming to be overwhelmed by intrusive thoughts. She was prescribed medication known to cause memory impairment, blurred vision, muscle relaxation, and, in high doses, loss of consciousness. According to medical records, Insu herself did not exhibit symptoms requiring long-term use of these drugs. What followed, however, demonstrated how methodical her thinking had become. Almost immediately after receiving the prescription, she purchased multiple life and accident insurance policies on her husband, ensuring she was the sole beneficiary. This sequence of events would later be central to the prosecution's argument that her actions were premeditated rather than impulsive. Insu's profile, as constructed by investigators, is not defined by chaos or emotional instability alone. It is defined by structure. She observed, learned, and adapted. She exploited social expectations of femininity, motherhood, and spousal devotion. In hospital rooms and family gatherings, she presented herself as attentive and gentle. Medical staff described her as tireless in her care. Relatives trusted her judgment. Each role she played reinforced the illusion of innocence. The most unsettling aspect of Insu's profile is not any single act, but the consistency with which she maintained this dual existence. To the outside world, she was a woman burdened by tragedy. To her victims, she was the source of that tragedy. And to the system meant to protect the vulnerable, she appeared, for years, to be beyond suspicion. This foundation, built long before the most visible crimes occurred, explains how Insu was able to act repeatedly without immediate consequence. Her story is not only about what she did, but about how easily her behavior blended into familiar social roles. Understanding this profile is essential, because it sets the stage for what followed next, when manipulation evolved into a sustained campaign of calculated harm. The death of Insu's 3-year-old daughter in February 2000 was officially recorded as an accident. According to the report, the child fell down a staircase and succumbed to her injuries. There were no immediate signs of external involvement, and the case was closed without further inquiry. At the time, few questioned the circumstances. Tragic accidents involving children, though rare, do occur. For Insu, however, this event marked a decisive shift. From this point forward, misfortune no longer followed her. It was engineered. 2 months after her daughter's death, Insu sought psychiatric consultation, stating that she was troubled by dark, intrusive thoughts. The physician prescribed medication known to cause memory impairment, blurred vision, muscle relaxation, and loss of consciousness at elevated doses. Medical records later indicated that Insu did not display a condition requiring such medication on a long-term basis. What followed demonstrated how precisely she intended to use it. Almost immediately after obtaining the prescription, Insu purchased 4 separate life and accident insurance policies on her husband, Lai. Each policy named her as the sole beneficiary. According to investigators, the timing was not coincidental. Insu understood the insurance system well enough to know that recent policy purchases would draw scrutiny only if claims appeared abnormal. Her solution was to make the injuries appear repetitive, accidental, and cumulative. That same evening, she crushed the prescribed pills and mixed a high dosage into Lai's drink. He lost consciousness and remained in a semi-comatose state for an extended period. This was not a single incident. Over the following weeks, Insu continued to poison him intermittently. Each time Lai regained consciousness, he discovered new injuries, bruises, concussions, memory gaps. He could not explain how they occurred. According to later testimony, while Lai was unconscious, Insu deliberately inflicted physical harm. She pushed him downstairs. She struck his head against walls. Each injury was carefully calibrated, severe enough to warrant medical attention, but consistent with accidental falls. Insurance claims followed. Doctors, seeing a blind eye and frequent injuries, attributed his condition to repeated accidents rather than external assault. The system responded exactly as Insu anticipated. The payouts, however, were modest. A few $100s at a time did not satisfy her expectations. In May 2000, Insu escalated her actions dramatically. After poisoning Lai once more, she approached him with a metal safety pin. While he lay unconscious, she stabbed both of his eyes, causing irreversible blindness. This act was not impulsive. According to court analysis, Insu knew that insurance compensation for permanent disability, particularly blindness, exceeded that of minor injuries. She also understood that a blind individual was more likely to experience future accidents, further reinforcing her narrative. When Lai was hospitalized, Insu transformed once again into the devoted caregiver. Nurses and physicians later recalled her constant presence, her calm voice, and her apparent exhaustion. To them, she appeared selfless. No one suspected that the woman at his bedside was responsible for his condition. Over the next 2 years, Insu continued to file insurance claims. In total, she successfully collected compensation from 58 separate claims, strategically distributed across multiple insurance providers. Her professional background allowed her to exploit gaps between companies, ensuring that no single provider saw the full pattern. Meanwhile, Lai lived in darkness, physically and emotionally dependent on the woman harming him. As the money diminished, Insu's cruelty intensified. According to medical records and witness accounts, Lai suffered burns, stab wounds, and repeated trauma. Each time, Insu provided explanations consistent with accidental injury or complications from prior wounds. Even investigators, when briefly consulted, accepted these accounts. On March 25, 2002, Lai died. His death was attributed to complications from accumulated injuries. Insu received a life insurance payout of approximately 341 million won, equivalent to around $200,000 USD at the time. Within a month, Insu entered a nightclub and met her second husband, Hung, a former athlete. Their relationship developed rapidly. Friends and family were immediately charmed by her appearance and demeanor. She married Hung, secured insurance policies in his name, and soon became pregnant. The pattern repeated with disturbing precision. Hung began experiencing unexplained episodes of unconsciousness. He suffered injuries he could not recall. Then, as with Lai, Insu blinded him using a V-shaped safety pin. Again, she played the role of the tireless wife. Again, doctors failed to identify foul play. Hung eventually died on October 12, 2003. What followed marked a further escalation. Insu turned her attention to her own family. She poisoned her mother and injected a substance into her eye, causing blindness. She repeated the act against her brother, later attempting to inject poison directly into his veins. In both cases, she filed insurance claims in their names. When questions arose, Insu attempted to erase the problem entirely. She purchased fire insurance on the family apartment and set it ablaze, trapping her mother, brother, and infant son inside. They survived with severe burns. Their survival, unexpected and undeniable, became the first crack in the structure she had built. From that moment, Insu's crimes grew more reckless. She set fire to the home of a woman who had offered her shelter. She attempted arson in a hospital ward. CCTV cameras finally captured her actions. Yet even then, authorities hesitated. It was not chance that defined Insu's crimes. It was repetition, refinement, and a chilling understanding of human trust. Each act followed the same logic. Identify a victim. Secure insurance. Inflict harm. Collect compensation. And when suspicion threatened to surface, destroy the evidence. This was no series of accidents. It was a system. By the time Insu's crimes began to unravel, the damage had already spread far beyond a single household. Multiple victims were blind. Several were severely burned. 2 husbands were dead. Yet for years, these outcomes had been absorbed by the system as isolated tragedies rather than evidence of a sustained pattern. The question investigators would later confront was not only how Insu committed her crimes, but why she had been allowed to continue for so long. The first undeniable warning emerged after the fire at the family apartment. Insu had purchased fire insurance shortly before the incident, a detail that initially went unnoticed. When the building was set ablaze, her mother, brother, and infant son were trapped inside. All three survived, suffering extensive burns. Their survival, unexpected and medically documented, forced doctors and emergency responders to reconsider earlier assumptions. Accidents alone could no longer explain the convergence of injuries surrounding Insu. Homeless and increasingly unstable, Insu sought refuge with a woman named Mrs. Kong, a housekeeper who allowed her and the children to stay temporarily. What followed demonstrated a shift in Insu's behavior. Where her earlier crimes had been meticulously planned and financially motivated, her actions now showed signs of urgency and emotional volatility. When Mrs. Kang asked her to leave after several weeks, Insu responded by setting the house on fire. The blaze killed Mrs. Kang's husband and severely injured her and her children. Days later, Insu appeared at the burn treatment facility where the surviving family members were recovering. Carrying a container of gasoline, she attempted to ignite their hospital room. This time, her actions were captured on closed-circuit television cameras. The footage showed clear intent. For the first time, there was visual evidence linking Insu directly to attempted arson. Despite this, law enforcement response remained cautious. During questioning, Insu offered an explanation that many investigators later described as surreal. She claimed she was compelled to start fires because she could see the spirit of her deceased daughter within the flames. While the statement was documented, authorities did not immediately arrest her. Instead, they initiated a broader investigation into the series of arson incidents. This delay proved costly. While under scrutiny, but not yet detained, Insu continued committing crimes. According to police records, she broke into a friend's home to steal valuables and later assaulted an acquaintance who had lent her money, causing permanent eye damage. Each offense reinforced the emerging picture of a woman who no longer believed she would face consequences. During this period, Insu's infant son also died. The official cause was Kawasaki disease, a condition with an extremely low mortality rate in South Korea. Medical professionals and family members expressed concern about the circumstances, noting inconsistencies with typical disease progression. While suspicions were recorded, insufficient forensic evidence prevented immediate charges related to the child's death. On October 19, 2005, authorities finally moved to arrest Insu. She was taken into custody on multiple charges, including murder, arson, attempted murder, and severe bodily injury. The scope of the case was unprecedented. Investigators were forced to reconstruct years of insurance claims, medical records, and witness statements across multiple jurisdictions and institutions. Insu's behavior during interrogation became a case study in manipulation. Initially, she feigned fainting, collapsing in the interview room in what officers interpreted as a calculated attempt to evoke sympathy. When this failed to halt questioning, she escalated further, deliberately humiliating herself in front of investigators. A photograph taken during this moment later became the only publicly available image of her for many years, as South Korean law strictly limited the release of suspect identities. Psychiatric evaluation was ordered prior to trial. Insu underwent the BCL psychological assessment, a test scored on a 40-point scale. A score of 20 or higher indicates severe mental disturbance. Insu scored a perfect 40. Experts testified that her profile suggested a rare combination of narcissistic traits, paranoid thinking, and emotional detachment. Importantly, the evaluation did not conclude that she lacked criminal responsibility. In court, Insu employed multiple defense strategies. She first claimed mental incapacity, arguing that psychiatric illness rendered her actions uncontrollable. When this argument failed, her defense alleged long-term domestic abuse by her husbands, reframing the killings as acts of self-defense. Prosecutors countered these claims with medical records, insurance timelines, and witness testimony that contradicted her narrative. Finally, Insu claimed she was addicted to drugs and required money to sustain her dependency. This explanation, too, collapsed under scrutiny. At the end of 2005, Insu was convicted and sentenced to prison. She was 29 years old. Even behind bars, reports suggested her behavior remained confrontational and entitled. She complained about unbranded clothing and low-quality toiletries, frequently clashing with other inmates. During one altercation, she lost an eye. To some observers, this injury appeared symbolic. A woman who had blinded others now lived with partial blindness herself. For nearly 2 decades, Insu's identity remained partially concealed from the public. It was not until 2024 that unedited photographs were released, reigniting public discussion about the case. Investigators interviewed years later acknowledged that her prolonged freedom was not solely the result of intelligence, but of institutional fragmentation and hesitation. This case exposed more than one criminal. It revealed how trust, when unexamined, can be weaponized. It showed how systems designed to protect the vulnerable can be manipulated through patience and repetition. And it demonstrated that justice, when delayed, does not erase responsibility, but it does multiply harm. What do you think about this case and the failures that allowed it to continue for so long? Comment below to share your perspective and to continue the conversation about the darkest corners of criminal history. At the end of 2005, the legal system finally closed in on Insu. After years of manipulation, deception, and carefully staged misfortune, the woman once perceived as a tragic figure stood before the court as a convicted criminal. She was sentenced to prison at the age of 29, facing the consequences of a life defined by calculated harm. There were no public apologies, no expressions of remorse toward the families she destroyed. According to official records, Insu accepted her sentence not with reflection, but with resentment. She remains incarcerated in a women's correctional facility, where reports indicate her behavior has changed little. Complaints about prison conditions, conflicts with other inmates, and continued displays of entitlement have followed her behind bars. In a grim twist of fate, she lost an eye during an altercation in prison. For many observers, this detail resonated deeply. A woman who systematically robbed others of their sight now lives with permanent visual loss herself. It is not justice in a poetic sense, but it is an undeniable reminder of consequence. The aftermath of this case extends far beyond a single conviction. Insu's crimes forced South Korean authorities to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic vulnerability. Insurance providers revised internal monitoring procedures. Medical institutions re-examined how repeated injuries within families are assessed. Investigators acknowledged that compartmentalization and hesitation had allowed a clear pattern to remain invisible for far too long. Most importantly, the case left behind a trail of victims whose lives were permanently altered. Blindness, trauma, loss, and displacement cannot be undone by a verdict. Families were fractured beyond repair. Trust, once broken at such a fundamental level, does not easily return. These are the consequences that rarely appear in sentencing documents, yet they define the true cost of prolonged criminal neglect. It is critical to understand that this story is not about a singularly intelligent criminal outwitting society. According to investigators who later reviewed the case, Insu's extended freedom was less a product of brilliance than of institutional failure. No single authority saw the full picture. Each incident was processed in isolation. Each warning sign was rationalized. In that space between departments, harm multiplied. There is a lesson here that reaches beyond one country or one legal system. Crime does not always announce itself with chaos or violence in public spaces. Sometimes it hides behind caregiving, paperwork, and social expectations. Sometimes it thrives precisely because it looks familiar and harmless. Justice, when it finally arrived, was decisive but late. And while the court closed Insu's file, the questions raised by her case remain open. How many warning signs are we willing to dismiss? How often do we confuse appearance with character? And how many tragedies unfold not because no one knew, but because no one connected the dots? This concludes the file on Insu, the woman known as the Black Widow of Korea. A case defined not only by cruelty, but by the silence that allowed it to persist. If you found this analysis meaningful, consider staying with us as we continue to examine the darkest corners of criminal history. The next file is already waiting to be opened.